there are a lot of opinion polls right now that show that Americans are not just divided, but like very deeply pessimistic about the economy. And this has left a lot of commentators and, politicians, even supposedly progressive ones, kind of scratching their heads because they say, well, GDP is up, like obviously unemployment is down, wages have gone up, even for the kind of bottom 50%. And so, you have a lot of commentators who are like, well, the economy is good on paper. So the question for you is, what explains this disconnect between everybody feeling incredibly gloomy about the economy, most working people, and then on the other hand, you have kind of like these elites who are saying that the economy is good?
Sure. The best way to get into this is to use a little bit of a metaphor. Suppose you don't feel well. You just your body is telling you aches and pains and all of that. Mm-hmm. And so you go to a doctor, whoever your favorite doctor is, and you ask the doctor, what's happening to me? Please explain. Give me a diagnosis of what could be ailing me. And the doctor sticks a thermometer in your mouth, pulls it out, says, gee, 98.6. You're in pretty good shape. Go home. Well, my guess is you're going to see a different doctor pretty soon because that's incompetence. Mm-hmm. The reason we have loads of different tests for the body and for something we call health is because there are a lot of different indicators. Picking any one or two or three is silly because it's going to give you whatever the one or two or three suggest. But by not looking at the others, crucial information, whether it reinforced or contradicted what you got from the first three, is lacking, and that's incompetent behavior. Okay, economy is exactly the same. It's just like your health, only it's economic health. And now we have to look at a variety of indicators that we have learned over 200 years or more are important signs, mostly, of how things are going. You don't get to cherry pick. You don't get to say, well, I'm going to look at your thermometer for your temperature. Then I'm going to look in your ear. And then I'm going to ask you questions about your diet. All perfectly nice things to do. But if that's the basis of your doctoring, I don't want to see you anymore. It's the same with an economist. The government is saturating the Democrats, including many people that I know personally, they are saturating the waves as people in power normally do, having picked one, two, or three variables that make the economy look good so that they can say the economy looks good. One of them is the unemployment rate. That's a big one. And there are two or three others. But that's not enough. You can't justify an assessment of the health of the economy based on one, two, or three numbers. That's just, again, it is so incompetent that you have to look at political or other motives to understand why otherwise reasonable people don't react positively. I mean, let me make it very personal. I got my PhD in economics at Yale University. One of my colleagues there was a young woman, at that time young woman, named Janet Yellen. She's now a very important woman, but she had the same professors I did, the same curriculum I did, literally sat in the same room, in the same business, hearing the same professor present the same lectures I did. She knows what I'm telling you. That's what we were all taught. But as a mouthpiece for the Biden administration, she does her political duty and talks about one or two variables. Let me give you some of the variables that are left out. Mm-hmm. Number one, I believe I've mentioned it. We have the highest degree of corporate debt in American history. Where does that figure in? Well, I'll give you an example. This last week, a cosmetics company, you know the name, I'm sure, Revlon, declared bankruptcy. Why? Because it is what we call in the business a zombie corporation. What does that mean? It means a company that cannot earn enough money to cover its expenses, its raw materials, its labor costs, and so on, and pay interest on its outstanding debt. So technically, it's dead. It can't cover its expenses. How does it live? It borrows. It borrows more to pay off the debts from before. We call that a zombie corporation. Revlon has been a zombie corporation for years. But now with interest rates going up, they threw in the towel because now it's completely overwhelming for them, the amount that they're in the hole. Well, there are, get ready now, thousands of American companies that are zombies right now as I'm talking to you. Nobody knows how many of them will go belly up over the next 6-12 months. But what we do know is in many of them, the workers are picking up details like there isn't toilet paper in the bathroom, or the coffee break is now with a machine that couldn't make coffee in a million years, or there's a fee to park your car in a parking lot when there wasn't a fee before. In other words, they're beginning to feel the walls coming in on them. Here's a second number. We are more unequal as a society in terms of the distribution of income, in terms of the distribution of wealth, in terms of the distribution of home ownership, and I could go on. And those realities are very much more in the forefront of people's minds than is an abstraction called the percentage of people without a job. Finally, we have a low unemployment rate, but you have to take into account, one, that we still have not recovered the level of labor force participation, that is the percentage of people who are adults who are in the labor force, that we had from before the pandemic. Number two, we have substituted on a massive scale jobs that are insecure, jobs that have minimal or no benefits, jobs at low pay for what were better jobs in terms of those variables. And everybody sees it, and everybody knows it, and everybody's family has individuals who, over a summer picnic, will make their complaints perfectly clear. I could go on, but I could show you that there are loads of variables that make it no mystery at all. And by the way, the Republicans, that's going to be half their campaign.
Right.
Between now and November. They're going to say exactly what Trump said when he was running against the Democrats. When he was the out, he would quarrel with unemployment numbers. Once he was in, he would tout them for his own purposes. But this level of, and let's be honest, this level of professional lying doesn't last forever. Everybody kind of figures out, what they say, who cares? And that's why the mistake of the Biden people is to mouth off like this and not wonder how that's going to play out when the public has such a different sense. I follow the consumer evaluations that come from the University of Michigan. They're the oldest and most widely respected surveys of consumer attitudes. They are at historic lows. People feel very badly about their current economic situation, and even worse in terms of what they foresee 6 months down the road. You have to deal with that. Throwing abstract numbers is not going to change anyone's mind in a way that I could see.
Right. One variable you haven't mentioned yet is the stock market. And I want to ask you about that because I personally find it pretty confusing. So, obviously during the pandemic, we all know that billionaires sort of collectively increased their wealth by, I think it was like a combined $5 trillion, thanks to, a stock market upsurge. I just read in Bloomberg that now the top 1% recently lost 1.5 trillion collectively because of the stock market falling. So, this is very confusing to me. I guess the question for you is, how exactly should we think about the relationship between the stock market and the larger economy?
That's good. The relationship there is, I'm trying to think of the right adjective to use. Well, it's like a marriage that's in trouble. There's a lot of suspicion, a lot of doubt, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of recrimination, all of that. And that's because the relationship is very complicated and these days really torn apart by what, Marxists used to teach us are things called contradictions. Let me mention a few. Number one, and these are, I think, in order of importance. For the first time in a century, the United States is challenged in its position as the dominant global capitalist economy. It's really had no competition for that role for a century. The little bit of incipient competition that it got from Germany before World War I, and it got from Japan before World War II, were definitively settled by those two world wars. In the first and second, the Germans were twice defeated. In the second, the Japanese were defeated. And that meant any potential competitor was completely out of the picture. There are Americans who believe, partly because of the current stuff with Ukraine, that the United States and Russia are or were competitors. There might be something to that in a political or even possibly a military sense, but is completely nuts economically. I mean, just to give you an idea, here is a basic number which I would guess most Americans don't know. The GDP of Russia today is $1.5 trillion. The GDP of the United States today is over $21 trillion. There is no comparison. There is no real competition here. One of these is an economic giant, and the other one is an economic midget. And the rest of it is all public relations and fantasy and Cold War rhetoric. The reality is that the United States was a dominant player for 100 years. It isn't anymore. It has a real competitor, and that is the People's Republic of China, whose GDP, by the way, is around $15 trillion. So you're talking about a powerful entity that for 25 years has grown 3 times faster than the United States year in and year out, and is scheduled to be a larger economic entity before this decade, the 2020s, is over. That is challenging everything in the way of stock markets around the world, repositioning societies in terms of how they're going to deal with this competitor, how they're going to not hitch their economic system to the wrong one in this competition. You can already see what is happening by the fact that huge numbers of countries around the world are not siding with the United States and Western Europe in the war between Russia and Ukraine, but are in fact siding with the other side. That's part of the adjustment. And Americans are very slow to admit or face any of it. Here's a second one. The pumping of vast amounts of money into the economy during peacetime is a new phenomenon. And that money going into an economy increasingly challenged by a competitor for the first time, made the decision, given the way money is introduced into our economy, the people in charge of all that money, borrowing it from the Fed, engaging in open market operations with the Fed and all of that, that money didn't go into producing goods and services. Mm-hmm. It went instead into the stock market because that was the more profitable deployment of that money. What happened was a few gung-ho investors borrowed money at virtually no interest rate, bought a bunch of stocks, were able 3 weeks or 3 months afterwards to resell them at a significantly higher price, did so, and then did this same game again. And others began to realize I can make much more money riding this upswing in the market than I can making chairs or making hamburgers or making anything in the way of goods and services. And so what we had was an artificial, if that's an appropriate word, deployment of a vast new amount of money in a very restricted area, namely the stock market. And it took off. Absolutely. It went crazy. The inflation we didn't have in the world of goods and services for the last 20 years, we had in the stock market. But as always happens, if it keeps going up and up and up, then sooner or later there are people who are going to say, oh my God, the gap between what the stock is selling for and what the underlying economy can generate over time in the way of real profits, that is so out of whack that I'm afraid that I can't continue to play the game that has been so profitable for me over the last 20 years, because I'm now at risk of being that poor sucker who buys at the peak only to watch it collapse. And then what happens is that the people who are smart enough to see this, and there are always some of them, start pulling out. That's what they did pretty much at the beginning of this year. And when that continued for a while, many more people watching it said, uh-oh, maybe the time has come for me to step to the sidelines and wait to see how this plays out. And then you have this self-fulfilling prophecy. Everybody pulling out produces the collapse that everybody feared. And that's where we are.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.